Today I will be presenting my critique of First Lessons in Our Country's History by William Swinton. And before we dive into the secondary account of Columbus, let me introduce the three sources that will be included in this presentation today. And although our main resource will be Swinton's textbook, we will also be comparing it to three other resources. So our first resource will be Lies My Teacher Told Me by James Loewen. And James Loewen is a historian, and he debunks the certain myths of Columbus. Our second resource will be the short account of the destruction of the Indies, written by Bartolomé de las Casas. And for those of you who don't know who de las Casas is, he was a Spanish priest, and he was a priest from Spain. And lastly, our other resource will be the Journal of Christopher Columbus. And we will be comparing and contrasting Swinton's textbook with these three other resources because we want to measure the credibility and knowledge of Swinton's textbook overall. And moving on, let's get into our contents for the slideshow. So slide number 1 will be Columbus's intended destination. 2 will be exploration prior to Columbus. 3 will be reasons for exploration. 4 will be Columbus's crew and their disc content. 5 will be the indigenous people of America. 6 will be primary sources and images. 7 will be, is Columbus a hero or a villain based off reading Swinton's textbook? So one fact that most resources of all Columbus state is that Columbus's intended destination was India. And although Columbus did not make that destination because of trade winds, etc., he still managed to discover America, according to William Swinton. And with exploration prior to Columbus, the Portuguese, Spaniards, and Italians had a long line of great explorers. Those ethnic groups came together and discovered West Africa. And this was stated on page 10 of Swinton's textbook. Europeans knew nothing about the world until Columbus went on his exhibition that was over 530 years ago. This was known as the New World when first described. This was also stated on page 10. And due to most not being aware about what the world was like, especially with its structure, most thought the world was flat. And this was stated on page 10. And this illustrates that before Columbus's time, according to Swinton's textbook, the world, especially Europe, in some ways was disconnected from what the world was really mostly like. Columbus wanted to change that. He wanted to revolutionize how people would see the world, which will later be explained. So there are mainly two reasons towards Columbus's exhibition. One, his first reason was mostly for religion purposes. And here on page 12, here's a quote from First Lessons in Our Country's History by William Swinton. And it basically states that he longed to bring the unknown barbarous nations of the Far East to a knowledge of the Christian faith. And in Columbus's journal also, which is a primary source, after he arrived to America, he wrote that they should be good servants and of quick intelligence, since I see that they very soon say all that is said to them. And I believe that they would easily be made Christians, for it appeared to me that they had no creed. Our Lord willing, at the time of my departure, I will bring back 6 of them to your highnesses, that they may learn to talk. And continuing to reason 2, it was mostly for trade. Italian merchants that knew Christopher Columbus were carrying rich trade with India. Both sides were trading silks, spices, and dyestuffs of the East by caravans. It was dangerous and risky. And this was stated on page 12. This is not a quote. It's a more simplified version of what I read. But here is a quote, though, however, that he longed to make a voyage that should decide whether he was right in his idea of reaching Asia by sailing westward. And this was also stated on page 12 of William Swinton's textbook. This And this reveals the other reason of Columbus's exhibition. Digging deeper in what is said in Columbus's journal, in my interpretation personally, I believe that this shows the selfish pride of Columbus that overtook him when he committed the genocide of a whole ethnic group. What definitely shocked me was that Swinton did not include the details of what was said in Columbus's journal, clearly showing the bias towards Columbus being more hero-like. Over here. So yeah. Now let's talk about Columbus's crew and their discontent. We will be comparing the two resources, which are First Lessons in Our Country's History by William Swinton and Lies My Teacher Taught Me by James Loewen. From what Swinton wrote, the book states that on page 15, it was the most wonderful voyage ever made. The ignorant fears of the sailors peopled the ocean with awful dangers. The compass pointed wrong, and the men thought that they were trade winds. And now let's read off the next box, this was stated on page 15 of Swinton's textbook. At length they grew mutinous and wanted to turn back, but Columbus stood very firm. And although most textbooks, especially Swinton's included, state that Columbus and his crew got into multiple arguments while going on the notorious voyage, James Loewen, a historian who also is the author of Lies My Teacher Told Me, challenges that myth by stating in his book that 6 of the 12 textbooks exaggerate the crew's complaints into a near mutiny. The primary sources differ. Some claim that sailors threatened to go back home if they didn't reach land soon. Sources claim that Columbus lost heart and that the captains of the other 2 ships persuaded him to keep on. Still, other resources suggest that the 3 leaders met and agreed to continue on for a few more days, then reassess the situation. When comparing these 2 resources, especially comparing Swinton's textbook to Loewen's textbook, it tends to question the credibility of Swinton overall, especially since it's clearly shown that he did not compare his certain accounts, which are here, to many other resources, unlike Loewen, who did. Let's now consider the indigenous people of America that had a huge role in the voyage of Columbus. Introducing the 3 resources, here is First Lessons in Our Country's History by William Swinton. Here is The Journal of Christopher Columbus and The Short Account of the Destruction of the Indies by Bartolomé de las Casas. Based on Swinton's textbook, Swinton stated that they were surrounded by the natives who gazed with astonishment on the newcomers. This was stated on page 16. All the natives they found were naked savages who kissed the feet of the Spaniards and exchanged their gold ornaments for beads. And that was on page 18. Based on Columbus's journal, which is a primary source, Columbus stated that I knew that the natives, were a people to be delivered and converted to our holy faith rather by love than force. I did not see one who was over 30 years of age. They were very well built, with very handsome bodies and very good faces. Their hair is coarse, almost like the hairs of a horse's tail, and short. They wear their hair down over their eyebrows, especially for a few strands behind, which they wear long and never cut. And lastly, based on de las Casas stated that after the wars and killings had ended, when usually there survived only some boys, some women, and children, the survivors were distributed among the Christians to be slaves. And the care they took was to send the men of the mines to dig for gold, which is intolerable labor, and to send the women into the fields of the big ranches to hoe until the land work suitable for strong men. And now I'd like to ask you viewers the big question here. What do we notice? Well, let me tell you. Swinton's does not include the mass genocide that Columbus committed against the whole indigenous society. This is included in De las Casas, that basically states like the genocide Columbus committed. Swinton also doesn't include Columbus's selfish desire of forcing the indigenous people to convert to Christianity with no free will. And he also does not include taking indigenous citizens against their will back to Europe and taking them as slaves for labor. And in my opinion, William Swinton's textbook is not reliable overall. Many times when we compare this resource to many others, especially in this instance, it shows there's a significant contrast in what is stated. And now let's compare these two images here. See, with Swinton's textbook, you can see that this is very peaceful. There is no violence in this drawing, and it looks like everyone is pretty much happy. While unlike here, this was in Bartolomé de la Casa's excerpt. This shows the Native Americans being hanged, and it also shows Christopher Columbus's men throwing babies against the certain walls. And it is honestly very morbid, and I feel like definitely there is a huge contrast, especially in what is stated and what is sketched in the textbook. And I definitely feel like William Swinton's textbook is not reliable overall because of the many bullets of a short account of the destructions of the Indies. So, yeah. And lastly, we have the question, is Columbus the hero or villain? So, in my opinion, William Swinton's textbook portrays Columbus as a hero, but if we were to compare this to other resources especially, it definitely unravels the fact that Columbus is a villain in general. This is because Swinton does not include the genocide Columbus committed against a whole indigenous society, and this is compared to De las Casas' resource. He does not include the selfish desires of Columbus wanting to convert natives into Christians against their will, and this is compared to the Journal of Columbus. And he also doesn't include that that Columbus took the natives and turned them into slaves of Europe against their will. He didn't include the fact that they were put in horrific conditions, and all the Native American citizens were dying by the bushel. And he kidnapped men, children, and women, and he separated many families. And it also wasn't reliable in general, especially when a huge myth of Columbus was he didn't get along with his crew, and I felt like that would definitely influence the story. I mean, not story, it would definitely influence the story of history, because it definitely changed the whole perspective in general. What did Columbus's crew really see when working with Columbus? So yeah, thank you so much for listening, and goodbye.